let's get it started. And it's good to see all of you again. And I do hope everybody is well and being safe and smart. And I do want to issue a little kind of public service caution. And it's as follows. You may have seen the information in the New York Times yesterday comparing New York with Europe, that we're doing very well in containing the virus, unlike the rest of the country, unfortunately. But I also heard some information yesterday, some of you may have heard it on NPR as well, that suggests one of the real difficulties with this virus is so-called stealth transmission, that it is transmitted by people who do not know that they have it before they've been tested or recognize that they are carriers of the virus. And there is some concern that people are leaving Florida and other hotspots and coming back to New York, people who have homes in both places or who have family. And so please just continue to be careful, because it does seem that it's possible that the virus is in fact going to tick up or may already have picked up in New York, even though we're not seeing it yet in the testing. So I just want to urge you to continue to be as cautious as possible. I'm going to jump right into my lecture, and I'm going to let me get the slides up for you. Give me just a moment. I'm having a momentary difficulty in finding it. There we go. Sorry. And let me make sure that it's in full view. Sorry. You are seeing, I hope, the screen right now. What's driving Trump's popularity down. Give me a moment. For some reason, this is not displaying correctly. All right. Okay, that's better. Sorry about that. I don't know exactly what happened. But let me tell you for a moment about my approach for today's lecture. I'm going to continue talking about public policy to address inequality. We've been talking for quite a while about rising inequality in the United States. And having documented and explained and analyzed rising inequality, I think the thing that we have left to do together is to really talk through what to do about it. And that's where I'm going to concentrate today. But I do know, and so I'm going to just refresh your memory that we were talking together about a work in moral and political philosophy, Why Does Inequality Matter, last week, and we'll talk a little bit more about that this week. But I also want to, because I know I've heard from various people that you're interested in being updated on the current election cycle. And rather than trying to rush through all my material in order to leave time for that at the end, I decided that I would start with that today. And then I can take my time with the material. If we don't finish it all, we'll have next week to continue. So let's start with the big national political scene. We are in the most peculiar or bizarre presidential election cycle I've witnessed, and I've been paying close attention to presidential politics since the mid-1980s, maybe not as long as some people, but certainly long enough to have kind of a historical perspective. And this is a truly bizarre electoral cycle. It probably would have been because Donald Trump is an unconventional candidate, to say the least, because we have a public sphere that has been transformed rapidly, and we really haven't developed the cultural resources or the public policy tools to manage it yet. And so there's a vast circulation of false information, as well as foreign interference. And that would have distorted and made unprecedented this electoral cycle. But then there's obviously the fact that we're in the middle of a coronavirus pandemic, what one critic called a once-in-a-century pandemic. And it's coinciding with, and in fact causing, a deep recession, perhaps a once every 50 years economic crisis. And we are also, and I don't think it's unrelated. I think you can't explain what's going on with protest politics in the United States in general, and in particular what's going on in Portland right now with federal troops intervening in the mainly peaceful protests of an American city. You can't explain all of that without thinking about the virus and the economy as well. But we're also in the middle of a once every other generation cycle of protest politics. And so this is a year in which many things are converging, coming together. And as a result, this is a very strange electoral cycle. And having said all that, let's get a little bit of information about what's happening. And as you can see, this is a polling average, and I tend to prefer the website called 538, and that's where this polling average is derived from. You can get similar data from Politico and maybe a couple other places as well. The methodology here, and you can see, right, that in addition to the lines, there are a bunch of dots, right? Each of those dots represent individual polls. How is Donald Trump doing? How is Joe Biden doing? And as you can see, those dots kind of range much more broadly than the lines do. The lines are weighted averages of those dots. And what that means is that as opposed to relying on a single poll, 538, this website, that's, by the way, the number of votes in the Electoral College, 538. 538 averages all of the polls that they consider to be credible, and they don't just have a subjective opinion. They look at how good polls have been in the past at predicting outcomes, and in particular, what the methodology of the poll is, right? And so they actually grade and weight the poll. If you have the very best methodology, if you're making thousands of phone calls and reaching a large proportion of the people that you try to reach, you are weighted more heavily than if your poll is exclusively online or reaches fewer people. So that's very quickly, just so you know, why it is that I consider this to be the most credible or accurate way of trying to figure out what's happening in the election. Now, please note, a polling average, even a sophisticated polling average like this, is a snapshot. It doesn't tell us what's going to happen a couple of weeks, let alone 3.5 months from now. But it does give us some sense of where things stand today. And I think one of the striking things to note, please note that this goes from the beginning of March through almost the end of July. And so that's really the entire pandemic period. And what you can see is at the beginning of March, Joe Biden had about 50 of the support in polls, and Donald Trump had about 45% of support. What you see is that that's gone up and down depending upon things happening in the news in the world, but that it's actually been very stable for a very long time, right? And so today, Joe Biden is polling within a percentage point or two of where he was polling in March. What's different is, of course, that Donald Trump has gone from the mid-40s to the low 40s. And I'll speak more about that in a little bit. But again, I think it's worthwhile noting that he began tailing off in the middle of March, and he actually went down a fair bit further in June. But he has never really cracked 45% support, right? And so the stability of Trump and Biden's numbers suggests to me that this is not merely a snapshot. This is a pattern, and this is a pattern that is stable for the time being. That doesn't mean it predicts what's going to happen. But I do think when you have a pattern like this, you think about two things. The first is what's explaining the pattern. I'll get into that in a minute. But I do think that it's not just the current moment, that people are beginning to make up their minds about Trump and Biden, and that more people favor Biden than Trump. So having said that, the second thing I wanted to say is that this is typical of American politics, which is that most American voters make up their minds in the summer before a presidential election. And our summer is most of the way over, and they make up their minds about two critical issues. One of them, and this is especially the case in elections with an incumbent president standing for re-election, one of the central issues is how well has the incumbent done at managing the economy? Is the economy good or bad? And many political scientists find this interesting, which is to say the president has been a president for 4 years, but the people don't make up their mind on the basis of the last 4 years. They often think only about right now, or maybe the last 3 to 6 months. And we'll see Donald Trump is suffering in that regard. The other issue that people make up their minds about by the summer before the presidential election, especially about the incumbent, is the character of the person who is the president, right? And so again, what we're seeing, and I think in a sense with Trump, who's one of the most, if not the most polarizing politicians in the history of the United States since probably the Civil War, we're seeing again, I think, a pretty firm pattern of people having made up their minds about Trump. Biden, I think, may be a little bit less secure in terms of the character issue, in part because his strategy thus far has been to stay out of the limelight, in a sense to let Trump damage himself and to not give Trump a target to attack, because Trump seems to be most effective as a politician when he is attacking an enemy or an outsider. One more thing I will say about this, which is, of course, the popular vote does not decide the winner of an election. The Electoral College vote does. That's why 538 is named 538, after the number of Electoral College votes. But having said that, it does appear that Biden is ahead in Michigan and Wisconsin and Arizona and Iowa by a smaller margin in Florida, and even in striking distance in Texas. And so one of the things that 2016 revealed to us is that the Electoral College may favor a candidate like Donald Trump, who's very good at rallying the white working class to his side. The white working class at this point is concentrated primarily in mid-sized to smaller states. They have their influence amplified by the Electoral College. And so it's entirely possible, as we saw with George W. Bush in his first election in 2000, or Donald Trump in 2016, to lose the popular vote but win the Electoral College vote. But I don't think that can happen if Biden maintains a lead of 6% or higher. Hillary Clinton got about 3%, 2% more of the popular vote than Trump did. It's got to be in that range for the Electoral College to potentially overturn the outcome of the popular vote, or to come out the opposite way from the popular vote. And I don't see that happening given where things are now. Final thing I want to say about this is this will almost certainly tighten. And I'll talk more about this. Well, let me talk about it for a moment. You can see that Biden took a little dip recently, right? He had been up on average 8.5 to 9% for much of the last month. And he's down a little bit. Trump's up a little bit, just over the last week or so. And Donald Trump seems to have, and his campaign seems to have, hit on a strategy for attacking Biden. And I'll describe that to you for a moment. The strategy is to say two things. The first is that the United States is teetering on the brink of a wave of disruptive and violent protest politics and maybe crime and disorder, right? That what's happening with the Black Lives Movement, what's perhaps happening with the economy and the virus, are unsettling the basic foundations of law and order in the United States. Now, Trump is saying this. His campaign is putting forth tens of millions of dollars of advertisements claiming this. I think the data absolutely does not back this up, but this is a campaign spin, as they call it, and we're in an era where it appears that campaign ads are less and less tethered to reality, that they will say whatever they need to do to win, especially, I'm sorry to say, Donald Trump's campaign technique seems to be to just create the narrative that best suits him. So stage one of this kind of two-step dance that Trump is doing to try to bring Biden down is to say that these are dangerous times for the United States, that the virus, the protests, the economy is going to increase the threat to average Americans. And then the second step is to say, and Joe Biden is beholden to the left wing of the Democratic Party, that he has been, if you will, captured by Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and the gang, that as a result, he is going to, if elected, work with them to defund the police because he needs their votes to win. He's not necessarily a radical leftist himself, but he is being directed by them or needs them so badly he's going to sell out to them. And that then As a result, he's going to do things like defunding the police, empowering Black Lives Matter, and the result is going to be that the wave of violence that we are supposedly witnessing is going to be impossible to combat. So that's the Trump strategy, right? As far as I can tell, what Trump's campaign has concluded is they're not going to be able to get Trump's numbers up in terms of approval rating. If there's a vaccine, if the economy starts to recover, maybe Trump will pick up a little bit. But we've seen that in the past, presidential candidates who haven't been able to turn their approval rating around by the middle of the summer have a very hard time doing so. So what Trump is going to do instead is to try to drag Joe Biden's ratings down, to discourage Biden's voters from voting, to generate a lack of enthusiasm for Biden so that Trump can win with a low approval rating. And I don't want to read too much into a little blip in the polling data. I think it's too early to see whether that strategy is going to work, but that does seem to be the strategy. And I suppose in a month or two, we'll have a better sense of whether or not it's working. Biden has not been especially aggressive in defending himself yet. And we'll just have to see if he decides that the strategy is working, whether or not he will begin to respond more aggressively. One of the things that an incumbent often has the advantage in doing is in defining his opponent, or at least in trying to define him. And one of the things I think Biden has been very good at is, in a sense, resisting the temptation to be pulled into a kind of back and forth with Trump that might allow Trump to define him. The fact that we have a pandemic and that Trump and Biden are not out on the campaign trail as a result is, I think, actually working to Biden's advantage in this regard as well. All right. So we also have, obviously, a race for Congress. And the data I'm showing you now is of limited help, because obviously what happens in the race for Congress is determined at the level of the states. And these are national data, but I just want to be clear about this. This is a generic congressional ballot poll. So people are asked, if you were to vote today for the House or for the Senate, would you vote for a Democrat or a Republican? And as you can see, roughly 8% of the population prefers there's an 8% lead for Democrats over Republicans. Republicans down in the low 40s, Democrats up close to 50%. And this kind of lead amounts to what is often called a wave election, right? A so-called blue wave if you color code the Democrats blue, right? And so this doesn't tell us everything that's going to happen. I'll get into this in just a moment with the Senate, at least, because of course the composition of Congress is decided at the level of the states, and what's happening in a national poll doesn't give us a lot of information about the states. But unless there is a dramatic change in these numbers between now and November, and that doesn't typically happen, this bodes very well for the Democrats retaining control of the House of Representatives, and it means that the control of the Senate is very much up for grabs. I'll say a little bit more about this in a moment, but I saw something, and obviously I follow this stuff kind of closely. If you would have looked at this a year ago, most political analysts would say 2020 is not a good year for the Democrats. They're defending more seats, and the Republicans are defending seats in red states, in states where the Republicans have a natural advantage, whereas at least a couple of the Democrats are defending seats in states like Alabama, where the Republicans also have an advantage. And so in a sense, people thought probably the Democrats would maybe lose a little bit in 2020. That's a year ago. Today, I saw a story that asked, might it be possible for the Democrats to win a 60-seat majority, a filibuster-proof majority in the Senate? The conclusion of that story was probably not. But one of the things that's interesting, and the story didn't comment on it, is that we're even having that conversation, right? A year ago, nobody would have considered that to be a sane conversation to be having. And so I think one of the things we see is that because Trump's approval rating is so low, and because increasingly all politics is national, right? That's the opposite of what Tip O'Neill used to say, all politics is local. As opposed to that, it appears that what happens at the top of the ticket drives everything that happens beneath the ticket. I'm sorry, in the Senate, the Congress, lower level races. And so this looks like a much more advantageous scenario for the Democrats than had been anticipated. So if we look at this state by state just for a minute, what we can see, and I'll ask you to focus primarily on the bottom line, right, which is that there are 23 Republican seats in play, 12 Democratic seats in play. Remember that the Senate is elected every 6 years, and so roughly a third of the seats come up every 2 years. So we've got 35 seats coming up this year. That's unusual because there's a special election in Georgia, and that of those races, 10 are thought to be competitive, and 8 of the 10 competitive races are seats currently held by Republicans. And on this map, the idea that could get the Democrats to 60 is not really in play. For that to happen, Kentucky and Texas and Alaska would have to be in play. But I think this is a little bit more conservative, this analysis. This comes from the Washington Post. And clearly Arizona is in play, Georgia is in play, Maine is in play, right there. That if the Democrats were to retain their seats and pick up those 3 seats, we would have a tie in the Senate. And you can see obviously that in addition, Iowa is clearly in play. Kansas might very well be in play. Montana might very well be in play. Part of what we've seen in the last month is the outcome of the primary elections, and the primaries in a sense went well for the Democrats in terms of them getting the candidates they think are most competitive in these states actually being their main nominees. So how unpopular is Donald Trump? And again, this is part of trying to explain why the Senate is in play, why the Democrats are doing so well, why Biden is doing so well. I would suggest to you, it's really not enthusiasm for Biden that is bolstering his political chances. It is just real concern about Donald Trump, the way in which he's handled the coronavirus and the Black Lives Matter protests, and the consequences for the economy and the country of his failure to manage those twin crises well. And so this goes all the way back to the day he took office, right? And as you can see, there's this tiny little moment where his approval rating is higher than his disapproval rating. But what I really want you to focus on is that this year, from January to the present. And he did actually get a little bit of a boost in terms of his handling of the virus immediately, the so-called rallying around the flag phenomenon. But since around April, his approval rating has been dropping consistently, right? And so He might have been up around 47% in April of this year. He's down to around 40%. Disapproval rating, 55%. That means he's at a net 15, right? 15% more people disapprove of him than approve of him. No incumbent has ever won re-election with numbers like that. And because our elections are increasingly national, this is really dragging Trump down. So that's the first question. Why are the Republicans so far behind? And it seems quite clear that having absolutely embraced Donald Trump over the last 4 years, and that was a slow and tentative, but then eventually enthusiastic and close embrace, that the Republicans are now incapable of distancing themselves effectively from this president, maybe issue by issue, but not in terms of their overall brand and electability. And then to figure out why Trump is so unpopular, I think this graph is perhaps the best way to indicate how poorly the United States has done in managing the coronavirus. And this is looking at other large and high income countries. So the gray line here is Italy. This gray line is Spain. This gray line is Britain. This line, gray line here, is Sweden, right? And you may remember that Sweden did very little by way of a lockdown. But what you can see here is by the time you get to July, every other large high-income country in the world, including those that were struggling in April, has the coronavirus under control, right? We can only hope that that remains the case. The United States, on the other hand, is the only country in this category. You know, we could see it in Brazil, we could see it in Russia, we could see it in Iran or Saudi Arabia, but those are not countries we like to compare ourselves with, right? We are a rich, developed, democratic society. You put us in that category, we are unique in our failure to manage the coronavirus. And again, there will be an effort to change the facts, to change the narrative, to not be held to account for this. And among the people in this country who are exclusively watching the right-wing media ecosystem, especially Fox News and kindred outlets, they may actually succeed in convincing those people that this is not the true impression of what has happened to this country. But frankly, I think that the number of people who are willing to believe those outlets and that narrative when their lives are at risk is not high enough to get Donald Trump reelected. And so part of what we're seeing here is, right, the fact that this country mismanaged the virus and the fact that Donald Trump was at the helm of the country when that occurred is dragging down his popularity and his electoral prospects, and with them, the Republicans as a whole. Second element to this, and I'll stop here, take some questions, but it has to do with the economy. And I could give you a lot more data on the economy, but I think this is perhaps the single most important metric or statistic, and this is unemployment claims, right? And as you can see, for the last 4 years, right, until the pandemic, we never had more than 1 million unemployment claims in a week, new unemployment claims, right? And frankly, that goes all the way back to the Great Depression. Not even during the Great Recession of 2007, 2008 did we get 1 million claims in a week. And since then, since the outbreak, the pandemic, mid-March, we have not had a week where we've had less than 1 million unemployment claims. And please note that unemployment claims, after having come down, leveled off and are starting to go up again. I anticipate, I don't see a scenario in which this doesn't get worse. And if we go back for a moment and look at how all these other countries managed, right? They were in bad shape in April and May too, but then they managed to get it under control. Their economies are beginning to cautiously and safely reopen. We're up here, right? There's no way our economy can safely and cautiously reopen. One of the organizations that tracks the coronavirus has had to create a new category for 11 states, primarily in the South and Southwest. They're calling them deep red for the level of transmission spread, the rate in which new cases are developing. And the other thing I think then that's worth noting is that we have two categories that we pay attention to when we're looking at this unemployment data. One of them is temporary job loss, and the other is permanent job loss. And in April and May, the vast majority of these people were in the temporary category. We are now getting to the point where the majority is in the permanent category. And if they're in the temporary category, if the economy is able to reopen, when the economy begins to come back, hopefully they get their jobs back. The people who are permanently unemployed, the firms, the restaurants, the stores, etc., that they worked for are shuttering, are closing for good. And so the economic damage here may be lasting and long-lasting economic damage. And again, this does not bode well for Donald Trump's re-election prospects. All right, so it's been a long time since we talked about national politics. I recognize that that was a very quick and quite high-level overview, but let me take a moment to see if you have any questions. I'm unmuting everyone. So if you're in the atrium, you can just step up to the computer and ask your question. If you're in your room, I may need to, no, it looks like everybody is unmuted. Okay, good. Anybody want to start us out with a question?
Yeah, I have a question.
Go ahead.
It's one thing to realize that Donald Trump is sliding down, but Biden is not coming up with any information how we would correct the problems that we are encountering. Wouldn't that be incumbent on him to let us know what we can expect of him? I think he's not doing it because we want to bait Donald Trump.
Yeah, so I understand exactly what you're saying. I'm not sure I would describe it in exactly the terms you're describing it. It seems to me that the better way to put it is that Joe Biden's policies are not attracting very much attention right now. Not that they don't exist, but he's not out forcefully campaigning to call our attention to them. And I do think part of this has to do with the fact that we're in the middle of a pandemic. And so the kind of campaigning that we would do in a normal election cycle just isn't happening. But it's also the case that the fact that we're in a pandemic, the fact that we've got protests on our streets, the fact that our economy is cratering, all of that in a sense pulls attention away from the policies. And so I do expect that Joe Biden will be calling greater attention to his positive proposals in the coming months. Please note, right, that we haven't even had the nominating convention yet. And so there will be an opportunity for him to do more to call attention to his proposals. But I also think, in a sense, we're in a very different kind of election. And so, in a sense, I think strategically, Biden may be right, which is that what's likely to change our minds is not the idea that Biden has the best policy in the world, so much as the idea that Biden will be a competent, trustworthy leader who will put good people in place and actually listen to them. And so one of the mistakes that people like me and you often make is to say, well, we pay attention to the details of policy, so everyone must. And it's simply not the case. Most people who make up their minds about how to vote make up their minds on the basis of an impression of the personality of the man, or their pre-existing partisan loyalty, or a bread and butter issue, like their sense that the economy is not doing well, and so you got to give somebody else a try. And I think, in a sense, Biden gets that and is responding to that. Anybody else with a question or a comment at this juncture?
Yes. Do you think we'll have a problem of an influx of people from Florida to New York State?
Yeah, okay, so not really an election question so much as a public health question. Are we going to have that problem? Yes. And I don't think it's a problem that is quite so specific either, right? The people from Florida may go to New Jersey or Delaware or Maine, right? All that has to happen is that people who are carrying the virus go to a place that is currently not suffering as badly, and then transmit it to people in that place, and then people from that place go to New York, right? And so just to speak to the policy issues here for a moment. Part of, it seems to me, the difficulty with the Trump administration's response to the virus is that it has not been a national response. It's been a response that gives priority to the states in making the most important decisions, as well as offering the most important forms of supply and support. Unless all the states coordinate among themselves, and that's highly unlikely to happen given the degree of polarization in American politics, then you've got this problem in which different states will adopt different policies. Some of them will adopt effective policies, some of them won't. And the states that adopt effective policies are going to become the outlet for the people who live in the states that don't, right? And you know, we're a society with a great interstate highway system and a very high rate of car ownership and no capacity to monitor our internal borders. And so all you got to do is get in your car and drive from Georgia or Florida or Texas to go back to your parents' place or your sister or brother's place in New York or New Jersey, and then the virus is on the move again, right? And so we need a national policy, a policy that demands uniform standards, provides adequate support to the states before that problem is going to go away. Sorry to say. So that's why I began the lecture by urging you to continue to be vigilant, because we're not going to know that the virus is and dangerous until the cases start turning up. I'll tell you a little story here for a second. My fiance's brother is a doctor. He just took his medical licensing exams, his USMLEs, and he got his results in 3 days. And the joke I told is you can get your medical license exam results quicker than you can get a coronavirus result in the United States today. I don't know if you've seen, but in New York, it's taking between 9 days and 2 weeks to get the test results. That's unacceptable. That means that the information we get today reflects what was happening 10 days or 2 weeks ago. And it doesn't tell us what's happening right now. So we do have to be careful. We do have to be vigilant because we don't know how prevalent the virus is right now. That should not be the case. It should be the case that we've got near instant testing and an adequate supply of tests and an adequate facilities to process those tests quickly. But we aren't there yet. And so we don't know how bad it is and how much has moved from Florida, et cetera, to New York. Anyone else with the question at this point? Yes, go ahead, please. Can you come a little closer to the computer so I can hear you?
Yes. How important do you think Joe Biden's choice of vice president is going to be in the election?
Yeah, great question. Thank you. I do think it's going to be significant. But let me say for a moment why, and maybe that'll help us to figure out how significant. Biden is being pulled in two directions at once here. The Democrats in many states have moved to the left on issues to do with race, on issues to do with immigration, on issues to do with the support of income for Americans who have been hit hard by the coronavirus, but more generally on regulation of the economy, provision of public health care, alleviation of student loan debt, et cetera, right? And so there is that temptation to pick an African-American woman, perhaps to say symbolically that he is going to do something about racial injustice in the United States, or to pick somebody progressive to say that he's not just going to be an establishment old school Democrat, but he is being attacked hard by Donald Trump on the right, saying that he's been captured by the radical left of the New Democratic Party. And so he's got that flank to defend as well, right? So all that to say, which of those two considerations is going to be more important, or is it going to be more important that Joe Biden essentially finds someone he thinks he can really work well with? Those are the kinds of considerations that Biden must be weighing. I assume he's going to announce his pick within a week or 10 days. We'll know quite quickly what the answer to this question is. How it will play out in the election, we will have to wait and see. But I think this is one of those situations where you've got to decide what your greater vulnerability is. Are you more likely to lose the progressive left because you choose another centrist Democrat, or to lose suburban white women because you choose a leftist progressive Democrat, right? And I hate to say it, well, I shouldn't say I hate to say it, I'll tell you where my analysis leads me, which is that Biden is much more vulnerable to the second problem than the first problem. The progressive Democrats all live in states where, I shouldn't say they all live, but they're concentrated in states where Biden is going to win if he's got any chance of winning the presidency, right? They're in California and New York and Oregon and Vermont. If Biden doesn't carry those states running away, even if he doesn't have a bunch of enthusiastic progressive support, he's just dead in the water to begin with, right? Whereas what he really needs is the white suburban women in Wisconsin and Michigan and Arizona to come out and vote for him. And they're more likely to do so if he picks a centrist Democrat like himself. So that's what that's where I think the political calculus points. Doesn't mean that's what Biden is going to do. I believe he has said some things about the fact that he might take seriously choosing an African-American woman. So we'll have to see if that's actually what he does. We'll know soon enough. Any other questions?
Thank you.
Yeah, of course. All right, so I'm not hearing any other questions. You can always push the space bar to unmute yourself if you want to, but I'm going to mute you. We've got about half an hour left, and so, no, we don't. Oh my goodness. We've got very little time left, but I'll go ahead and I'm going to do one part of the lecture, and then I'll let you go. We got a little bit of a late start today, and so let me get you into the current lecture, the substance of the current lecture. And I want to refresh your memory. We were talking together about T.M. Scanlon, emeritus professor at Harvard University in the philosophy department, his book, Why Does Inequality Matter? And the anatomy of reasons to object to inequality intrinsically, not just because those who do less well are badly off, but because of the difference and either what the differences do to people or else how the differences arise. And we talked about the kinds of inequality that lead to status differences, lead it to be the case that we look at somebody and say, you're on a different rung of the ladder. You have a different standing than me. And for those kinds of judgments to be consequential to social fate and belonging in a society. And that when you have wealth that gets to be that unequally divided that it gives rise to status differences, that's intrinsically objectionable. Objectionable because it means that people are going to be excluded from the opportunity of forming friendships and relationships with the full range of people that their society contains, because they're going to be based not on the content of their character, but on the neighborhood they live in or the kind of car they drive, etc. And that it also gives rise to power differentials that lead those who have high concentrations of income and wealth to be able to control important aspects of the lives of those who don't. And so for all those reasons, too much income and wealth inequality is objectionable intrinsically because it gives rise to status differences. I now want to concentrate on two other arguments, and I'm going to be quick so that we can wrap things up for today. But I want you to see the structure of the argument that Scanlon is presenting. And he makes two arguments, and these are in central chapters in this book, Why Does Inequality Matter? One of them is an argument for fair equality of opportunity. The other is an argument for political fairness. And the point that I'm trying to get to is the parallel and the structure of the reasoning that supports these two rather different ideas. So fair equality of opportunity, everyone should have the capacity to compete for the kind of job or position of authority and privilege that they have the intrinsic capacity and develop skills to do well. If you live in a society with fair equality of opportunity, the family that you're born into should not matter for the station that you rise to, right? And so that's one idea. The other idea is political fairness. And here the idea is about, if you will, control of the political agenda, as well as the kinds of policies that regulate your society. And here the basic idea is that every person, irrespective of where they started life, whether their family was rich or poor, but also where they are in life right now, whether they themselves have been professionally accomplished or not. Every person should have an equal opportunity to influence the formation of public opinion and the outcome of political decision making. Now, note, equal opportunity to influence doesn't say that your ideas should be equally weighted. If you don't have any good or original ideas, then there's no reason to pay that much attention to you. But if you do have good ideas, there is no reason that those ideas should not be paid attention to other than the quality of the idea, not the status of the person offering the idea or the resources that the person who supports the idea has to make the idea get paid attention to. So now, having set out these two different categories, let me just briefly point you to the structure of the argument. And for Scanlon, both of these arguments have two components, one of which is an institutional fairness component, and one of which is a fairness in filling positions component. So with the economy, with fair equality of opportunity, Scanlon suggests that institutions that define positions of advantage and associated powers and rewards need to be justified. That sounds pretty straightforward, right? But the point is that you need to be able to say that having this kind of institution does some meaningful good. And I'll give you an example. Right now in the United States, corporations have corporate boards. That is to say, boards of governors who determine the big policy decisions for the corporation. Do they issue dividends? Do they get a new CEO or chief financial officer? How much do they pay those high-level employees? Do they settle a union negotiation, etc.? Those boards are composed almost exclusively of wealthy investors and other CEOs or high-level officials. In most European societies, Germany would be a good example, corporations have boards as well. But the membership on the corporate boards is composed not only of investors, but also of workers and customers of the firm. And there's rough equity and representation on the board. And so one question would be, are we justified in having corporate boards that exclude stakeholders, employees, and consumers, and only represent shareholders, right? Europe has a stakeholder model, we have a shareholder model. That's a choice. Which way of organizing our economic institutions is justified, better justified, right? Similarly, if we have colleges and universities, Do they equally allow everybody to compete to get a place? Do they favor the children of their own alumni? Again, this is a question about whether or not the institution is justified in its overall operation. If it is, then it's fine that there be some positions like CEO or admission to a very good college that have disproportionate advantages and powers and rewards associated with them. But if the institution as a whole is not functioning in a way that serves a socially valuable mission, then you can't justify the good position within it on the basis of the good that the institution does. Secondly, and relatedly, such positions need to be filled by those with the right qualifications, so that the selection for the people who get the best positions is sensitive to their qualification. When I speak about boards that have only CEOs and other high stakes investors on them, is that the only perspective that we want represented on corporate boards? What's the social effect? And if so, aren't there maybe some upstart entrepreneurs out there who would have really good ideas? If this becomes an old boys network or a club in which the CEO from one firm is on the board of another and vice versa, and they both give each other big raises, then we're not necessarily filling the position in a way that allows it to really fulfill the function that justifies the institution. In addition to that, there's one more principle that Scanlon defends, and this is what he calls substantive background fairness. So that in addition to the firm or whatever the organization is playing a socially valuable role and allowing everyone to compete for its position and getting the best qualified people to hold those positions, all persons have to have a fair and equal chance to develop the qualifications to compete for these positions, right? If those demanding principles are met, fulfilled, then we have institutions that play socially valuable purposes, positions with them in them filled by people who are qualified to do the best in doing the work that we require of those institutions, and everyone having the opportunity to develop their skills. Scanlon says, in that kind of society, if the CEO makes 20 times more than the average worker should be able to accept that and not consider that to be unjust, unfair, an unfair inequality. Because the average worker recognizes the firm being organized the way it is good for everyone, that the CEO has qualifications that he or she as an average worker doesn't have, and that he or she had the opportunity to develop the requisite capacities and skills, but either couldn't or didn't, right? And so the institutions at that point may generate inequalities, but those inequalities are fair and justified and just. All right, so I think I should stop my presentation there today. I hope this is making sense. And let me just conclude with a simple thought. I've shared with you the idea that the United States has gone from being a much more equal to a much more unequal society. And so my suggestion to you is that at least for white Americans, Americans of European descent, in the 1950s and 1960s and 1970s, it appeared to many of us that those principles were generally satisfied. And that over the last 30, 40, 50 years, we've moved away from satisfying a principle of fair equality of opportunity. And the reason so many people are so angry and resentful of American politics right now is precisely because our system seems rigged, no longer seems fair or just. I will stop there. Happy to take some parting questions if anybody wants to raise one. I'm unmuting everyone now. Go ahead.
How do you change this situation?
How do you change the situation? Yeah, you and Stanley and others are impatient to hear me talk about this. And I promise I will talk about it next week. But let me just say, we've got to change the tax code. We've got to change the education system. We've got to change housing as well. The problem is not that there aren't public policy tools that would help us to address this. The problem is that we have lacked the political will, the focus, the energy, and that our political system has been, on the one hand, paralyzed by partisan polarization, and on the other hand, captured by big donors on both sides for so long that we haven't adopted the policies. But I want to share some of the details of those policies with you. And if you recollect, I want to put them in two categories: those things that I think we can accomplish quite readily and easily, as opposed to those that are going to take a real change in the composition of Congress and the presidency and the capacity to get things done collectively. The kind of change that, if the stuff I shared with you in the first half of the lecture is accurate and holds through November, there's at least a slender chance that the next Congress and president may be able to get a little bit more done. Anyone else?
Thank you.
Of course, of
Thank
course.
you.
Okay, everybody, thank you. Take care, be safe, don't panic. You don't need to be frightened, but you do need to be careful, please, okay? Take care, everybody. See you next week.
Okay.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Take care. Bye-bye.